Recording for this meeting has begun.
Hello, my name is Dan Morris, and I would like to welcome you all today to joining us in a review of the ABPMP CBOK Chapter 5, which is on process design. Oh, still having, okay. Now, for most of these webinars, I give the introductions to people, and so I guess I'll be doing it for myself today also. I'm certified from, I'm a CBPP holder as well as a certified business architect. I'm currently a principal with Wendon Consulting. I've been the North American practice director for 3 major consulting companies. And over the years, I've written 3 books on business transformation, over 50 papers and articles. I speak internationally at a variety of conferences. And I have a monthly column that I would urge everybody to go out and check out for PECs. Now, one of the things that I'd like to stress in going through this is, you know, the CBOK was a collaborative effort. Even though we had individual chapter authors, which you can see on the left-hand side of the slide, we wanted to have this not be the opinion of any individual in any given subject area. So, first of all, there was a review of each chapter by all of the people all of the chapter authors. That changed the text. We then went through a series of multiple reviews with different industry experts to also change the text, but make sure that we had a consensus, a collaborative effort on all the topics and all the coverage that are in the CBOK. So for those of you who have had a chance to take a look at it so far, what you're seeing is a collaborative effort, a collection of thoughts from very experienced people. First of all, the authors are certified business process professionals, but in addition to that, by different industry experts, different people from Gartner, Forrester, different authors who you would recognize, Spanny, Fangar. So we went to fairly great lengths to make sure that what we had in here is current and represents the most advanced thinking in the industry, but that it's also realistic and it reflects what has happened in the industry in real projects. Now, what you see now is really essentially it's a table of contents at a high level for Chapter 5. The significance is that we begin by creating an understanding or making sure that we have an understanding of the business operation as it exists today, with recommendations for how we might be able to improve it based on an analysis of the current or the as-is. We then move on to look at different things that deal with limitations from an IT perspective, as well as limitations from a business operating perspective. There are timing limitations. There's a variety of things that need to be factored in, as we all know. We then move down to the redesign itself, and with that redesign, we start to look at how can we innovate? How can we be creative and looking for different solutions to what we're doing? And we'll be moving all through, or discussing that today as we move through the different topics covered in the outline. We were fortunate in putting the CBOK together to work with a bunch of really great industry analysts. It was my pleasure to work with Jim Steiner, who at the time was with Gartner as a distinguished analyst and vice president. And one of the things that did was it gave us more of an insight into where the industry was going. So we talked certainly we've lived the history, and we've lived, how is this happening today? But we were also able to introduce a flavor of where things are going through the involvement of people like Jim. And I would urge you all to follow Jim on his blog. And if you haven't seen it or weren't aware of it, Jim's new book, Business Process Management, The Next Wave, is out. And I would strongly recommend the book to anyone who is interested in looking at where this is all going. Now, in looking at redesigning, we have to really start by building our base. And, I've dealt with a lot of projects over the years that have been failing, and what we've had to do is they brought me in to turn them around. And one of the things that's taught me is that one of the key things driving success or problems is the foundation itself. First of all, this really has to be business driven. And you have to have realistic estimates and a real commitment, not just lip service, but a real commitment from both the business side managers and IT. So the commitment really needs to go far beyond the sponsor and start to get into the commitment from the people who are actually not only going to be involved, but also affected by the change. So that gives you a different perspective when you start to put them all together as to what's really expected, not just what's written down, but what's really expected, because that is the foundation for ultimately determining success. So we have to move everyone to a common agreement on scope, goals, success criterion, and then how is success really going to be evaluated? Because if it's left up to opinion, it's really a tough road to follow, because people's opinions change, and oftentimes they change by the day, whether they're angry with somebody on the team or not. You have to have the right tools also in place. For larger projects, more sophisticated tools that do more for you shorten the time that it's going to take to do it. If you have basic tools, Visio, that type of thing, that's good, but they don't do a whole lot. So as you start to move out of the smaller projects into the bigger projects, the tools that you have available become extremely important in what you can do and how you can do it and the time that it's going to then take in order to do it. And we find that, if we have these things missing, the risk is going to start to increase. And the more of these things that you have missing, the greater the risk to the overall project and the design. Now, one of the key areas that we found that will give us problems is common definitions. And as a real brief example, I've been in workshops where I start the workshop by asking people to write down their definition of these three things. Process, what does it mean to you? Workflow, and modeling, what are we going to be doing? And it's amazing at how many different definitions you really get to terms like this. And what that's shown is that what we may think is just a standard term and everybody will understand it might not really be so. And so it's important to look at the terms that we're going to be using, and as new terms come up, adding them, but creating a dictionary of the terminology, first of all for the project, and then secondly for the broader look of what's going on with business transformation. And have that dictionary available to everybody who's going to participate in the project so that you can all come to a common understanding. And I'll digress for just a second here. When you start to look at process, I've had people call process everything from a couple of tasks that they do to cross-functional, multi-business unit activities. And, certainly we can adjust, but if you aren't aware of what we'll say how those terms are being used within a given group of people or amongst different divisions, you can really start to run into some trouble. What we like to see from the CBOK A process is a combination of all the activities essentially needed to deliver a product or a service. Then a workflow is a piece of a project or a process down typically at the business unit level, where we start to then look at an aggregation of activities that ultimately support a specific business function. And then modeling is the flow of those activities. How do they relate to each other? What types of support do they have? What's the sequence? What are the timing issues? And a lot of those different types of things then start to come into play. So that's really the foundation for, first of all, for the CBOK, and secondly, for this discussion today. Now, when we start to look at the models themselves, we notice that we have an opportunity to start to what we'll call them level those or decompose those models from process. Now, before I go through the hierarchy here, I'd like to point out that this isn't an industry standard. Different people have different stacks with different names on them. The stack that you use is not all that important. What's important is that you use one, and that becomes the standard for discussion within your organization. So we'll consider this an example. At the process level, then being cross-functional, cross-business unit, cross-organization, that breaks down then into sub-processes, which deliver, as an example, if you're looking at a car engine, a sub-process would build the carburetor, or a sub-process might put the manifold together, or something like that. They all come together and you have an engine, which is build the engine is the process. Within sub-processes, we start to break into functions. Those functions then are supported by specific workflows that deliver the output or deliver that capability, that function. Typically, at the function level is where we go from more of a conceptual level, which is process and sub-process, to a physical level, which is actually doing the work, the tasks and the steps needed to do the work. So as we go through this, we start to look at the decomposition, and where it makes sense, we can do that. Now, oftentimes, the business people, when we work with the business people, we're working down at either at the activity workflow or the task workflow. When we're going to generate applications with the new design, we need to get a little more specific, and that's where we get down to the step level. So those are the levels that you need to start to keep in mind as you build your new models and start to move into how the organization is going to function in the future. Now, we know that business operations are a complex maze of activity. They're not simple. Everything affects everything else. And we find, though, that the complexity is a result of an evolution over time. And that, first of all, few essentially workflows or business operations were ever actually designed. We know that because of a lot of different drivers, everything from changes in the business operation, changes to law, changes to situations. We know that the rules are constantly changing. So business is in a constant state of flux. It's one of the problems IT has had in the past, is that by freezing systems, by doing things where you have to stop and essentially say, we're going to take a snapshot in time, what you wind up with is delivering something that is out of date minimally by as long as it takes you to build it. So if it takes you a year to build a system, the service or solution that you wind up deploying is a year out of date to the business. And then you have all the change management, everything that you're trying to do that. And it creates a situation that's been very difficult. With iteration, with the BPMS tools, with the things that we have available to now, we can change quickly enough where the majority of that problem can be negated. Now, the other thing here that I'd like to point out on this slide is that one of the things that we found is business and BPM and the way BPM and BPMS is used has evolved. We're now seeing it address larger and larger and more complex projects. And as that happens, we're starting to see a lot of differences in the way things are done, even within individual organizations. Some of those differences lead to success, and frankly, some don't. So we suggest that any redesign of a significant piece of the business really needs to be directed by a methodology so that there are standard ways of doing things, standards, techniques, standard rules for the data that's going to be collected, that type of thing, so that the models and the information ultimately can be put together from the different people who are doing it to support the overall project that's underway. Now, some of the problems will be familiar with you all, and probably this list could go on and on for about 20 slides. But some of the things that we've run across that I'd like to point out, because they're things that can be fixed without a lot of time or effort or money, is that a lot of organizations, although they say they really want innovation, really aren't ready to support it. So we find that there's actually a limited appetite for creativity and for innovation. And that's something that you need to figure out with the people that you're dealing with. How far can you go with changing the business operation? And there are a lot of different things that come into play there. But figuring out how big that box is, because there's really a box that you need to play in. So figuring that out is really important. It should not be approached as an IT project. IT is a support group, and it's critical, but it's support. The business redesign needs to be conducted by business professionals, not by IT professionals, just as the things that need to be developed by IT professionals and not business professionals. Each has their place in the project. We already talked about starting out with a firm foundation. A lot of organizations also have a problem because their models follow really no standard at all. Now, BPMN with BPMS and 2.0, or whichever version you may have, is a good start. But it doesn't go far enough because it doesn't address the performance requirements in your organization. It doesn't address compliance requirements. A lot of things that, the modeling standards that we have today don't address that need to be folded in. Same thing for data collection standards. What are we going to ask for? How far are we going to go in getting that? We have to get additional information. As an example, if we have, if we're going to do simulation, we do if we're not going to do simulation. Agreement on success and staff involvement is really, really a problem today in a lot of different organizations. But these things and a variety of others start to have a definite impact on the problem. And the takeaway really from this slide is to identify those things that are going to be a problem and then try to mitigate them. To look at what the key success factors are, what the potential problems and the real problems that you know that you have now are, so that you can either mitigate them or remove them from consideration. Now, a process, and what's process design? Well, process design is really just a definition of the goals, deliverables, and organization of the activity and rules needed to produce a product, service, or outcome. It begins with some type of flow modeling that aggregates the work and moves through to essentially look at how the processes are performed amongst the multiple business units that are involved. This is an important thing and something that I've written about because it's quite possible when you're focused on an improvement, especially within a given business unit, it's quite possible to make an improvement within that business unit that allows you to hit all of your requirements, all of the standards that you're looking for, all the goals, but in doing that, remove things or change things that downstream in another business unit might cause some serious problems. So you need to kind of look at things holistically as you start to look at changes. Now, some companies are starting to move to a process orientation with process owners, and that's great. They can be a significant help in pulling together all of the people who might be affected by a given change, and you really need to involve them. And we talked a little bit about how the projects are changing really from narrowly focused to more mission-critical, larger types of activities that we can now do. And that's really, actually, it's a good thing because it shows success in the smaller improvement projects. So we've been building momentum over time. But the outcome, or the bottom line, is that those successes can either be based on, again, as we have said before, they can be based on interpretation or opinion, or they can result in measurable improvement. And wherever possible, we need to figure out a way to measure that improvement, and we'll be talking a little bit about how to do that in a minute. And then, start to measure things and review things in terms of the overall workflow. Now, why do we do process design? Well, in the past, we found out that creating specs through a few workshops, handing those specs that are now business specs to IT to convert to system specs, and then build systems, which they then bring back to you, doesn't really get us what we want. So the way that things evolved from that point was to start to look at the business operation, and the question is, well, how do we do that? And that's really how process and workflow were really, we'll say, identified as key drivers in any type of business operation change. And doing that, interestingly, found that few of the processes run the way people think they do. Management and most managers, I should say, have a pretty good understanding of how things conceptually work. But the proof of the pudding is in being able to do it. And where people have told me they understand exactly how things work, I've asked them to. Randomly, we go up to the organization, sit down, and I ask somebody to lead for a while. I tell the guy to sit down and do the work. And most of the time they can't, nor should they. But what it points out is that the organization is in constant change. Rules are in constant change. People figure out how to get around problems. People figure out how to get the work done. And we'll be talking about the white space that it creates a little later. But you figure it out. But as you do that, the organization becomes in a constant state of flux, causing modifications. And when people then start to look at things and ask questions on how to do it, the procedure manual is now out of date. And so the way that Shirley, who sits next to Sally, does something is the way that it becomes institutionalized. Because Shirley's figured it out, so Sally asks her how to do it, and that's that. So the organization works fundamentally the way that everybody thinks it does, but at a very detailed level, oftentimes we find some significant variations. When you start to look at process redesign, you find that there are basically, now this isn't, can be divided different ways, but basically, there are 5 different phases. As is or current state modeling, as is analysis, where are the problems, what are we doing, what are the opportunities? to be both business and IT design. How can we fix things? How can we make things better? Simulation and iteration. And that has to be considered to be optional. I believe in it, and I strongly recommend it, but there aren't that many organizations that really do it, or do it very often. But there are reasons, we'll talk about that later, to do it. And then some type of testing. I like to use a model office, but you need to test and train and deploy. And so those are really, at a basic level, 5 different phases that we go through. The way that it all really comes together is some driver will cause a project. That project then will deal with different modeling, updating, first of all, the as-is model, making sure that they are somewhat current. And from experience, I'll tell you that models that are out of date are worse than no models, because unless you go in and refresh them, you don't know what's real and what's now been replaced or changed, and you don't know how it's been changed. So you'll be making assumptions that are not valid because what you're looking at, the current state model, doesn't reflect the business. So as a first step, it's really important to bring those as-is or current state models up to date. And the analysis is really where you prepare the foundation for all of the change that's coming, which deals with workflow issues, IT support issues, white space issues, problems, and a variety of other things. Based on those recommendations, based on that analysis, you can now start to look at how do we change things? How can I improve? What can I innovate on? How can I transform? And what can I deliver with low risk, but at the same time delivering flexibility and an ability in the future to change rapidly? I personally don't believe that it's enough just to fix the problem, because you know that next week, next month, the world's going to change again. So in delivering flexibility and rapid change, you now go beyond what's actually expected, but you're setting people up for improvement in the future. And then simulation, iteration. Iteration is one of the hallmark issues of BPM. Try it, test it, iterate, until you get it to the point where the test says you've now met the goals or exceeded the goals. So that ability to iterate is extremely critical. Well, when you try it, test it, and then iterate it, that testing, then somehow you have to figure out, what are you really testing? You need to go beyond the traditional IT tests and look at the impact on the business and the way that works. And that's where simulation comes in. That gets you to a technical success. Ultimately, you can prove through those simulations that you meet the technical requirements. But you still now you can be a technical success and a business failure. And I've seen that a lot. So you now move into a model office test where you actually simulate the business operation and how it works. And you can then go beyond yes, we've hit all the tick marks on the requirements, and start to look at how easy is it for people to use. Okay, moving on. Now, we know from experience that BPM and BPMS isn't a problem. They work. We know that IT is not a problem. It can build systems that work. So where's the problem really lie? If all the technology that underlies everything can be made to work and can be shown that it works, where's the problem? Well, the problem really is in the way that you change the business. And that's that business process redesign. IT can be made to support anything. The key is, what's the definition of anything? How does that really work? And you need in figuring out the answer to that, what's the solution going to be? You need approach consistency with technique standardization. And you need to actually start to limit risk. Now, this becomes, something that becomes we'll say the overriding direction and essentially, we'll say, limiting factors for the entire projects. If you don't have a methodology that you've built into the project, each of the teams, and in a larger project, you're going to have multiple teams. Each of those teams will head off and do things a little bit differently. And then as you start to put them together, they really don't fit very well. And in looking at methods, we find that to make things fit well, you need to have the methods, you need to have the standards that dictate everything from the data that you're going to collect, which we've mentioned, to the techniques. But we also find that trying to apply an IT methodology to the business side doesn't really get us where we want to be. So we find that what we need to do is to control the project through a planning that's based on a combination of waterfall and agile techniques, concepts, and methods applied differently at different points in time to give us both the control that waterfall provides and the flexibility that agile provides. But the methodology, if you want to use it for more than one project, has to be flexible. So you need to be able to adjust it to the demands of the project. But the bottom line in managing these larger types of BPM projects is that you have to be able to orchestrate, coordinate the integration of skills, concepts, techniques, and different perspectives from multiple groups that are participating in the project. And this becomes real critical because as these different groups come in, they view things from the perspective of their own disciplines. And whether it's a technology discipline, whether it's Six Sigma, whether it is, pick one, there's a lot of them. And what has to be done through this orchestration is to bring those all together, recognizing what each does and where the overlaps are, pull them together so you can have a common focused way of doing things and a common focused view. Now, I'm going to run through these next few fairly quickly, and at the end I'll be happy to take any questions that may come up on this, or if we don't have time for all of your questions, I'll be happy to, if you send in a question, I'll be happy to get back to you personally. Last month we talked about the as-is modeling in Chapter 4, and that modeling is really the foundation for everything that we do. And the way that you can analyze different parts of the business, look at problems, look at goals, and look at the impact of those goals is significantly different if you have an as-is model, current state model, or if you don't. I know a lot of managers have asked in the past, well, why do we need the current state? We're just redesign it. And it really doesn't work that well because you don't know then the history. You don't know the support. You don't know the limiting factors. You don't know the governance. So, and the list of what you don't know is a lot longer than the list that you do know at this point. We suggest, because of that this redesign starts out with a scope review. So you can make sure that all of those who are involved have a common understanding of what their roles are going to be, what they're going to get out of it, what the company's going to get out of it, the timing, and the commitment of resources that you're going to need from them. Now, the larger projects, as we said, really need to follow a formal project plan. That project plan really needs to be the driver for the estimate. And a lot of organizations when a project is first conceived, there's an estimate that's pulled out of the sky, and you have to live with that estimate. The problem is that it makes things very difficult to essentially achieve. So we suggest that at this point in time, once you understand what the project is really going to be moving forward, that you take another look at that estimate, and that estimate now become adjusted based on the types of technologies that you think you're going to want to use, the timing of those technologies, the types of changes that you're going to be involved in. And that not only deals with IT technologies, but in a manufacturing situation, it deals with production technologies. So there's a variety of things depending on the type of organization, the type of industry that you're looking at, that you need to fold into that. And all that comes together then to essentially re-baseline the estimates and to deal with expectation management. Now, any company itself is a complex network of customers, suppliers, collaborative partners, workers, rules, financial history, market reputation, and a lot of other things. The reason we have that list here is that these are some of the things, not all of them, but some of the things that as you're starting to look at how do I want to change this business operation, you have to look at the impact from a variety of different viewpoints. Certainly the workers are going to have a different perspective than your customers. Your collaborative partners are going to have another viewpoint. If the project is going to be successful, the perspectives, the viewpoints of these different people who are going to be affected, they may not be directly involved, but they're sure going to be affected, okay, need to be considered. And this is where you start to fold in things like voice of the customer and different mechanisms that you are going to deal with from a customer perspective. This is also where you start thinking about social media and how you want to interact with those customers. How do you want to interact with your suppliers? Do you want, what type of inventory systems do you want? So there's a lot that goes in right at this point in time to start to look at the foundation for changing the business operation itself. So one of the things, first of all, that a lot of larger projects don't consider that really should, is how's this project really going to relate to strategy? If you're now going to open a new line of business in the Far East, or you're going into Europe, or you're now going to go maybe multinational or even multi-state within the U.S., what's the impact? What's the impact on the business? What's the impact on knowledge? What's the impact on legal? What's the impact on communications? And how do you interact with IT to start looking at that infrastructure change that might be needed? Looking at the strengths and the weaknesses of the business. How do you leverage the strengths? How do you eliminate those weaknesses? You have to define them. And in defining them, you can have a lot of political problems. So you have to be aware of that and start to figure out how do you want to deal with them. Same thing with problems, opportunities, technologies, constraints. Looking at all of these different elements and how they're going to affect the design and how they're going to affect what you need to include in this moving forward. Now, redesigning any business operation is, first of all, you've heard of people, process, technology. And we've talked a little bit about process, we've talked a little bit about technology. But ultimately, it's about people. People will ultimately like it or dislike it. If they dislike it, not only are you going to get a lot of complaints, but oftentimes we see things actually reversed out simply because the people have hated it. So their involvement and their opinions count. The way that work is controlled, the standards, the policies, the procedures. People all need to have a say in how these are interpreted and how these are going to, in fact, affect the new design. Now, technology is going to enable, and we can either see it as the great enabler, or in some companies, it's a serious constraint. Whichever it is, we need to know, because that becomes a foundation consideration in the new design. Where are those limiting factors? How can I get around some of them, or how do I use this? How far can I go in this new design? And the bottom line with any new design is, from the review of the as-is models, you'll be able to create problem matrices, opportunity matrices, different things like that. How does this affect that? Now, one of the things with a problem matrices, and the reason I suggest that everybody put them together, is you list all the problems, and then you list across the top all the places that that problem could impact. In those cells at the intersection of those two, you put the impact in the terms of dollars. What that gives you is, as you go through and redesign things and you eliminate this problem, it tells you what the result is. How much have you saved? What have you really done? That can be added to the making all of the goals, the objectives, achieving all of those improvements, and be added in as a direct benefit. Same thing with opportunities, because as you take advantage of an opportunity, you at that point have a benefit associated with that. Otherwise, why would you do it? So those benefits from the opportunities and the problems can be shown as a direct line impact of the project. Some people focus on efficiency, and I would suggest that the focus first be on effectiveness. What are those things that you absolutely have to do, and what are those things that you don't need to do? Then what's left, you can worry about efficiency among. Because if you're doing the wrong thing efficiently, well, you haven't really made much of an impact on the operation. So the first thing we want to do is to make sure that we only do what we need to do. And then the second thing is make sure that we do it the best way we possibly can. Now, in this part, we're really looking at the identification of rules and really some of the problems. We've already talked about the problems, and we have problems that we can find in just about every action, but certainly in data element use, in handoffs, in wait states that we can find as we start to look at the models, decisions that are not supported properly, or decision trees where that decision has to go through an approval process. I've seen them go 5-7 people deep. And you have to question, why do you need all those levels of approval? So there are a lot of things that you can look at as you start to look at those models and the rules that then drive that activities such as decisions, and start to see what's reasonable and what's not reasonable, and what skills people really need. Well, you often find that people, because of the way something has evolved, don't really have the skills. They've been kind of learning them on the job and doing things, but they don't understand the why behind it. And so oftentimes we find that we can get a significant performance increase if we have some formal training for certain of those activities that go in there. And from my perspective, all of the goals in the project have to be measurable. If it's not measurable, you're never going to know whether you've accomplished it or not. So to the degree possible, I would suggest you work with the business managers and then IT, people who are in your Lean Six Sigma group, a variety of those people to come together and say, here are the goals. How are we going to measure them? What data do we need to measure them? Where are we going to get that data, and how do we pull that forward? And that becomes a critical component of looking at how you are going to move forward and how you're then going to justify success at the end of the project. Need to look at all of the manual work, the white space work. We find that white space work is typically work that is either under-automated or not automated at all. It's work that just creeps into the organization. And as it does so, people adjust, people change. As I said, they're creative. They have to get the work done. They have to do their jobs. So need to look at that white space and see what of that white space we can just eliminate, and then what activities in that white space that we might be able to automate. And dealing with white space, I often find that by reusing or using some parts of legacy applications that are in existence today, we can certainly cut out some of those steps. People don't know the capabilities of those systems, so they just get around it. We also find that people have asked IT to make changes, and because of the priority structure, those changes will happen in 6 months or a year, and so they have to get the job done and just figure out a way to do it. So we know that by looking at that white space and looking at what's going on and working with IT to look at the systems that support it, we can often, on a fairly immediate basis, and this is kind of the low-hanging fruit, start to look at how we can reuse some of that things to eliminate some problems and eliminate some manual work. Now, in looking at moving forward, we've talked a little about effectiveness and efficiency. You know, one of the things that deals with that really gets into redundancy. In one organization, I found that people were in two different parts of one division. They were making copies of the same document, and finally, the file cabinets were literally 50 feet apart. And when I asked them why, they said they didn't trust the other one to keep copies of the documentation, which, you know, was kind of ridiculous. So we put some controls in place and got rid of one of those. You know, you need to, as you're going forward, not only look at making your goals today from the project, but look at how you can get into continuous improvement. So I recommend to everyone that in any design that you're putting forward, you really need to look at, you know, embedding Six Sigma and embedding manual audit and different ways of looking at the information to make sure that observed inefficiencies are built out of the process, that the feedback that you're going to get from your performance monitoring not only helps you make sure that the inefficiencies are out of the process today, but they don't creep back in the future. Need to identify hold points, things where things just stop, waiting for something, and figure out how you can shorten that time, that wait time, or maybe even eliminate it. Look at handoffs. The big problem with handoffs deals with timing and then the quality of the work that you get back. So you need to build in ways to look at that. Decision points, rule-based, as I said. The interesting thing with decision points is that in addition to the decision itself, the rules that govern it, and making sure that those rules are still effective and still give you the compliance that you're looking for, follow the legal requirements for things like HIPAA, you know, that in certain industries apply. But where those rules are made in the process, can you make a decision up front that eliminates the requirement for decisions further downstream? So a variety of things in looking at that and how you can minimize the number of decisions that can be made. And then, you know, looking at the collection of performance management information and making sure that not only for the initial release of the application, but you're getting that information on a continuing basis, pushing that through the Six Sigma performance measurement systems, different things that you may have, hopefully into some types of dashboards that will give you better information about how the operation is working, and possibly using things like breakpoints and pain point analysis, inference concepts. Look at that information and start to say, here's what we need to do about it, here's the timing that we need to do about it. Some of it, if it fits in inference, can just be done automatically. Other things will have to be put up as a warning to management. But all of that performance management needs to be built in at this point. Now, we've already talked about white space and that type of thing. We've talked about cutting unnecessary work, applying resulting rules and policy, defining the support that we need. So we've pretty much covered this as we've gone through. We haven't flipped the slides, but we've covered the topics. Getting back to simulation, and this will be the last slide that I covered today, simply because of time. And simulation and iteration. The simulation becomes really important. I suggest that companies with their as-is models also run it through simulation, so you have a firm foundation for baseline and where you are today. That also makes sure that you understand where the data needs to come from in order to do performance measurement. And most of the big and better BPMSs, you have simulation capability, or you can make it simulate at least. And with that, you have the ability to innovate, try it, see what happens, see if you like it. If it's close, fix it, and that's the iteration. If not, back it out, do something else. Through that, you can, first of all, as I mentioned, show that it meets, in your first design, show that it meets all of the specs, show that it meets all the performance criteria, and then once the IT side has completed, and you do that within the context of the BPMS using a technique called stubs and drivers to simulate what's going to happen across any of those interfaces. While you're doing that, IT takes the specs that you provided and from the new design and starts to build the interfaces, starts to build new social media apps, that type of thing, so that the two can come together then. And when that happens, you then need to simulate again to show how this actually works, to make sure that you didn't make the business operation actually inefficient. So, and then you can iterate through that also. So at this point, you can now show that you have a technical success as well as a business success. So that will end my discussion today. And I'd like to throw it open for questions. I have a couple questions here. Which companies nowadays excel in business process orientation? Most of the larger companies have been involved in BPM for some time. I know that even mid-sized companies, Sloan Valve is pretty advanced. I'd say they pretty much excel in this. Some of the larger insurance companies, some of the larger banks also do. So rather than giving specific company names, but then some industries, I would say, the banking industry, most of your banks, the insurance industry, most of your insurance companies are a little farther ahead. Some manufacturers are pretty good. So there's a variety of things in different industries that do it. But I'd say, Sloan Valve, Bank of America, and others. Now, if we have to choose two out of quality, cost, time, which two are most important in process design? Well, that depends on the company. I'd say right now that I'd say that quality is the most important. One thing that's not on that list that I'd say is the second most important is customer. And the reason I put quality first as opposed to customers, if you don't have the quality, you're going to lose the customer. Then cost and time are really measures that we have to consider. But I personally look at them as somewhat secondary. If I don't deliver the quality, but I bring whatever it is on cost and on time, what have I really done? So if I'm going to vary, I'll vary on cost and I'll vary on time, and I'll get the project blessed based on what's delivered and the impact of what's delivered. That varies by company, depending on what your company allows you to do. How can top management be convinced to commit to business process design instead of randomly making decisions? That's tough. The only way that I've seen that commitment happen is over time and through the delivery of benefits that you said you're going to deliver. That's really where a lot of the things that we've been talking about come into play, though. Management's going to trust what they know works. And so at the beginning of anything that you become involved in, you have a little bit of a problem. But over time is really the way that I would suggest that you make that happen. Start to deliver small successes and then medium successes, and then gain their trust as they start to see the technology and the people actually delivering. Also, it helps to do internet searches where you can find a wide range of success stories in different industries, and those can help build your case also. I'm up against the time. I have two more questions. I'll try to get through those quickly. Isn't the subdivision of process into 6 lower levels going to confuse the average employee who looks for instructions on how to carry out his or her work? Absolutely. That's why that decomposition is in a tool, and it's mainly for IT to start to look at how they can clump work. The business operation itself happens at the activity workflow level. In some cases, it'll drop down into the task level. What the business user will look at, and all they care to look at, is really that activity workflow level. If we start to, focus on the way the structure comes together, you can often confuse them. People can pretty much understand, a process model itself is pretty high level, not difficult, and that shows them how what they do fits into something bigger, the overall picture. And you can show that to them, but I found that's not where you need to really discuss things. So the user, the business user, really typically lives at the workflow activity level. And by keeping them there, that's pretty much how we can avoid that confusion. They can also understand how that activity can break into to tasks, because either they or their people perform those tasks. So at those two levels is really where they work. When you start to get down below the task level, at the step level, that's really where you're going, not as much for the people who are doing the work as much as you're going to that level of decomposition for IT. Now, I would suggest at the activity level and then below it, the activity level has to have with each activity associated rules. It has to have different standards and things like that that are applied to it. It also should have application support, so you're listing the applications that need to support it. When you get then down to the task level, with those applications, you now start to define the data that passes back and forth. You also start to define the screens, what's on those screens, and behind those screens, what the edits are. And that then carries down into a more detailed description even at the step level. But that description starts to really drive the application generation from the BPMS. The final question here is, does the element of trust between employees and management play a significant role? And the word is, absolutely. One of the things that we really didn't have too much time to talk about right now is the role that change management plays. At the beginning of the project is where change management really needs to start to make sure that everybody is aligned and all of the key managers understand the scope and those things that we had talked about. Throughout the project, though, there needs to be an ongoing interaction between management, the team, and the people who are going to be affected by the team. And that interaction, that openness, is how you then would build trust. And building that trust is absolutely critical, because I've seen projects essentially made to fail where those people are afraid that they're going to lose their jobs. And a very quick example is I was brought in to look at a failing project for a large automobile manufacturer, and went through and then, did a real quick analysis and came back to the vice president who brought me in and said, well, you set the project up to fail. And he said, well, what do you mean? I said, you told the team that they have to find 20% reduction in headcount. And then you told the team that they're not protected. So who do you think is going to essentially eliminate their own jobs, so they're now out on the street looking for another job? So if you want to succeed, you have to protect people. And I like to have headcount reduction happen in vacant positions, and I like to retrain and shift people wherever I can. And where you do that, you start to gain trust from the people, and the company starts to have a very different relationship with the people who are going to be affected. I'm out of time, and I want to thank the people who have hung in here and gone over with me. I know that there are some things that I hoped I could cover that I just didn't have a chance to because of the hour. Please feel free to send in any additional questions. I'll be more than happy to answer them. And if we go a couple slides back, by the way, these slides will all be on the ABPMP website so that they can be answered, so that you can look at them again at your leisure. And you'll find this slide out there. If you either call me or send me a note, I'll be happy to address any issues in detail that you may be interested. Again, I'd like to have gone into more detail, but given the time that we had, it had a lot of ground to cover. So I'd like to thank you for joining me, and look forward to seeing you next month as I introduce the discussion on Chapter 6.